Everyone in Lavender Hills followed the rules, or vanished quietly if they didn't. But when a pink envelope arrived at 12-year-old Marissa Kincaid's door, threatening to evict her dying grandmother, she didn't cry. She opened the attic instead, and found a letter so powerful it would bring the entire HOA to its knees. Marissa Kincaid sat on the edge of her grandmother's creaky wooden porch, her legs swinging just above the sun-cracked tiles, clutching the pink envelope that had just been shoved into their mailbox. She hated those envelopes. Everyone in Lavender Hills did. They always meant trouble, and this one was worse than the others. It wasn't just a fine this time. It was a warning. Final notice before legal action. Her 12-year-old fingers gripped the letter tighter, the heat of the Georgia sun making the ink feel sticky under her touch. Behind her, the house stood like a stubborn old soldier refusing to surrender. It was the last original home left in Lavender Hills, a small white cottage with a brick chimney, faded blue shutters, and a garden full of wild marigolds. Every other house on the block had been remodeled into the HOA's preferred colonial style, with matching driveways, dull beige walls, and regulation hedges. But not Grandma June's. She kept her bird feeders up, her pink mailbox standing, and a tiny sign by the door that read, "Love grows here." That alone had earned her 3 citations this year. Marissa opened the envelope and read aloud the newest offenses. Non-regulation paint color, unauthorized window planter boxes, excessive dog noise. She paused and frowned. Dog noise? Biscuit, their tiny golden mutt, barely barked. He snored more than anything. And what was wrong with flower boxes? Inside the house, Grandma June was resting in her recliner, her gray hair tied in a low braid, an oxygen machine humming beside her. She had once been a public school teacher, the kind who used to bake cookies for her students and handwrite notes of encouragement. Now she was quiet most days, her strength dwindling with each hospital visit, but her mind was still sharp, and her heart fierce. When Marissa walked in and handed her the envelope, June took one look and sighed. "They won't stop, baby girl," she said softly. "Not until they take everything." "But how can they do this?" Marissa asked, sitting beside her. "You've lived here forever." June didn't answer. She just stared at the photograph on the wall, a black and white picture of the house from the 1980s, with her standing in front of it, young and proud. It was the year she bought the property, long before Lavender Hills was fancy and guarded and ruled by retired military men and real estate investors. Back then it was just land and dreams. Outside, a black SUV slowly rolled past their driveway. Marissa watched as the window rolled down, and a man in sunglasses stared directly at them. She recognized him, Cordell Thatcher, the HOA president, former colonel. The man who had fined a neighbor $200 for putting a plastic flamingo in his yard. He smirked slightly, then drove on. "I hate him," Marissa muttered. June patted her hand. "Hate makes you bitter. But truth? Truth makes you powerful." Later that evening, as the cicadas hummed and the sun sank low behind the hills, Marissa wandered into the backyard. The garden was overgrown in a way that made it feel like a secret world. She climbed onto the old wooden swing, her notebook tucked under her arm. She had started writing everything down, dates of fines, names of families who'd been forced to sell, whispers from other kids about cameras and bushes, and warnings to stay quiet or be next. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let them take her grandmother's house. Not without a fight. Marissa didn't sleep that night. The air inside the cottage was thick with quiet sorrow and the faint hum of Grandma June's oxygen machine. Every time Marissa closed her eyes, she saw that pink letter again, its language cold, final, almost smug. She lay on the couch, the scratchy plaid blanket pulled to her chin, listening to Biscuit breathing softly on the rug below. Somewhere deep in her chest, a knot of fear pulsed, but beside it, something else had started to grow. A small, stubborn fire. The next morning she pulled on her hoodie, slipped her notebook into her backpack, and rode her bike to school. As she pedaled down the neat, winding streets of Lavender Hills, she noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. A cracked curb covered in spray paint warning of immediate repair. A tiny garden gnome toppled over in someone's flower bed, and a new pink envelope taped onto the windshield of a red pickup truck parked slightly over the painted line. At the end of one cul-de-sac, she passed the Yu family's house. Their basketball hoop had been taken down. Inside the classroom, Ms. Delaney began a lesson on state history, but Marissa couldn't focus. Her eyes drifted to the window, where she spotted Mrs. Daniels, a middle-aged woman with a teenage daughter, sitting in her driveway surrounded by cardboard boxes. Marissa remembered her from the community picnic 2 summers ago, laughing and offering homemade lemonade. Now she looked hollowed out, like someone who had lost a war no one else could see. At lunch, Marissa sat alone beneath a large oak tree, her peanut butter sandwich untouched. She flipped through the pages of her notebook. She had written down the citation her grandmother received the week before for non-HOA compliant birdbath design. She listed neighbors who'd vanished, the Schwartzes, the Nguyens, the Blackwells, all fined out of their homes. She included quotes she overheard while walking Biscuit. One woman had whispered, "Don't push it, they're watching." Another man had said, "Thatcher's got friends in the county office." Nothing sticks. When she got home, her grandmother was asleep. Marissa sat beside her and held her hand. The once bright house now felt dim and tense, like the whole place was holding its breath. On the kitchen counter was an unopened letter from the HOA's legal firm. Marissa opened it slowly, the paper trembling in her hands. It was a notice of intent to seize the property, a formal warning of accelerated community reclamation proceedings. She didn't understand every legal word, but she understood one thing. They weren't just trying to fine her grandmother anymore. They were trying to steal the house out from under her. Later that night, Marissa returned to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows. She began digging through old boxes again, looking for anything her grandmother might have kept, anything that could matter. She found report cards, old love letters, a collection of worn-out teaching certificates. Then, buried beneath a stack of faded Christmas decorations, she saw a folder bound in a cracked leather strap. It was labeled Lavender Hills and Original Development Records. Marissa slowly opened it, careful not to rip the brittle pages. The first sheet made her heart skip a beat. It was a hand-drawn map of the community. Before the gates, before the HOA, before everything had become beige and cold. 4 houses were circled in red, including her grandmother's, and beneath it, in cursive ink, were the words, "Exempt per primary deed and existing homestead rights. Permanently protected." She stared at the page, then looked again, blinking. Could this really mean they had no right? Could the HOA be bluffing all along? Her fingers dug deeper into the folder, pulling out notarized documents, original signatures, and even a yellowed letter from the county clerk's office dated 1982, confirming the exemption status of the property. Marissa didn't sleep that night either. She stayed at the kitchen table with a lamp on, carefully scanning the pages into her tablet, saving them twice, then printing them at dawn using her grandmother's old inkjet printer. As the papers slid out one by one, her breath quickened. For the first time in days, she didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dusty blinds, as Marissa placed the printed documents into a clear binder and tucked it into her backpack, carefully wrapped in a grocery bag for protection. Her fingers were jittery, not from fear, but from something closer to adrenaline. Her grandmother still hadn't spoken much since her mild stroke, but that morning, when Marissa gently pressed her hand and whispered, "I found something important," June's eyes opened a little wider. She squeezed Marissa's hand in response just once, a weak but certain sign of hope. Outside, Biscuit whined as Marissa opened the front door. Cordell Thatcher's black SUV was parked directly across the street, engine off, his tinted window rolled halfway down. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He wanted her to know he was watching. Marissa stared straight at him for a moment, then mounted her bike and rode away. The SUV didn't move. At school, she avoided everyone. During history class, her teacher assigned a group project, and Marissa quietly asked if she could work alone. The teacher agreed with a sympathetic nod, likely guessing something was wrong at home. Marissa didn't care. She had more important things to do. During lunch, she sat in the library, scanning and rescanning the documents again. The folder had more than just the exemption clause. It included correspondence from the original builder, emails printed out from a decade ago where June had declined to join the newly formed HOA, and even a letter from a former board member who had since moved away, stating in plain English that June's property was grandfathered in with full protection. But most importantly, there was one document that made Marissa's breath hitch in her throat. A comparison between June's actual signature and the one on the HOA compliance form, which June never signed. They were completely different. One was fluid, strong, and familiar. The other was jagged and uncertain, as if mimicked by someone guessing the look of her name. It was a forgery, and it had been filed with the county registrar. Her hands trembled as she traced the lines on the forged document. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone, Cordell or one of his cronies, had deliberately signed her grandmother's name to make it look like she'd agreed to the HOA rules. That was illegal. It had to be. Even a 12-year-old knew that. Marissa checked the community center bulletin board during her ride home. That's when she saw the notice. Lavender Hills Open Forum, Thursday, 6 p.m. All residents welcome to attend. HOA announcements, grievances, and resident comments welcome, limited to 2 minutes. Her heart raced. That was tomorrow night. Back at home, June was awake, but still weak. Marissa sat beside her and carefully explained what she had found, slowly, clearly, showing her the documents one by one. June's lips parted slightly, and her eyes glistened. Her hand moved to the side of her chair and tapped the armrest, a sign she used when she was frustrated. "They forged it, Grandma," Marissa whispered, placing the forged compliance sheet beside her real signature. "They lied. And now I have proof." June made a raspy sound, and for a moment Marissa thought she was trying to speak. She leaned in close. June whispered, "Attic, metal box." Marissa blinked. "What metal box?" June squeezed her hand again. Marissa returned to the attic just before sunset. She moved the Christmas boxes aside and found a heavy rusted tin box tucked behind insulation near the baseboards. Inside, there were 3 cassette tapes labeled with names and dates, a flash drive, and an old silver pendant necklace wrapped in tissue. She set the necklace aside and plugged the flash drive into her tablet. It contained audio recordings, grainy but clear enough. One of them was a conversation between Cordell and another board member, recorded on June's front porch 4 years ago. "She'll give in eventually," Cordell said on the tape, his voice unmistakable. "She's old. Let's just file the form and deal with her later." "You sure about that?" "That's a legal signature," the other voice replied. "She won't fight. She can't. And even if she does, who's going to listen to some dying old woman?" Marissa's blood boiled. Her grip on the tablet tightened. Her grandmother had known. She had tried to stop them once before. She had even recorded them. But no one had listened. Now someone would. The next day, Marissa printed photos of the signatures, copied the deed page, the audio transcript, and taped a checklist inside her notebook with the words written at the top in big letters. HOAOPENFORUM SPEAK. She looked at the time. 6 p.m. tomorrow. She had 1 day left. And this time, they wouldn't silence her. Thursday evening arrived with an unusual stillness. The streets of Lavender Hills, normally humming with the faint echo of lawn mowers and the low murmur of porch chatter, were quiet. Marissa stood at the edge of her driveway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, the binder tucked protectively inside. She wore her school uniform, not because she had to, but because her grandmother had always said, "When you need them to take you seriously, dress like you're already somebody." So she did. The community center sat at the heart of Lavender Hills, surrounded by perfect tulips, flagpoles, and a marble plaque that read, "Unity, Order, Excellence." Marissa parked her bike around the corner, out of sight, and walked the last block. Cars were pulling in slowly, residents emerging in business casual clothes, greeting each other stiffly. Many didn't make eye contact. The forum was never really about the residents. It was a show, a rubber stamp session where the board made announcements and ignored concerns. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lemon polish and plastic chairs. Cordell Thatcher sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the other board members, Mr. Kirkland, Ms. Dobbs, and Mr. Neville, all of whom wore matching navy jackets with HOA pins glinting proudly under the fluorescent lights. Cordell's arms were crossed, his jaw set like granite. He scanned the room as if sizing up soldiers. The forum began with routine announcements: street paving schedules, lawn inspection rotations, and a new rule against non-neutral patio lighting. A woman asked about her driveway fine and was dismissed. A man asked to build a ramp for his disabled father and was told he needed architectural approval and $450 in application fees. Marissa waited. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, but her face remained calm. When Cordell finally said, "If anyone else would like to speak, you have 2 minutes," she rose from her seat in the second row and walked up to the microphone. She could feel everyone looking at her, some curious, some pitying, and a few clearly annoyed. Cordell's eyebrows lifted in amusement. "Name?" he asked, already disinterested. "Marissa Kincaid," she said, adjusting the mic. "I live at 1145 Mosswood Lane with my grandmother, June Kincaid." Cordell leaned back. "I believe we've already addressed your compliance issues through the appropriate channels." "I'm not here about compliance," Marissa said, her voice steady. "I'm here about corruption." A low murmur moved through the room. Cordell's lips curled slightly. "Miss Kincaid, if this is a personal—" "It's not personal," Marissa interrupted. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the binder. "It's legal." She opened it and placed the copies of the original deed, the grandfather clause, and the forged signature on the podium. "This is the original development agreement for Lavender Hills. It clearly states that certain homes, including mine, are exempt from all HOA rules unless the owners opt in. My grandmother never opted in. This is her real signature. And this," she said, holding up the compliance form, "is a forgery." Several people gasped. Cordell opened his mouth, but she continued, louder now, unwavering. "This is an audio recording of Mr. Thatcher telling another board member to file the form anyway, and deal with her later. I've transcribed it. It's on this flash drive. And if anyone wants to hear it," she held up a small speaker, "I can play it right now." Cordell stood. "This is inappropriate and—" "No!" someone in the audience called out. It was Mrs. Daniels. "Let the girl speak." Another voice chimed in, Mr. Yu. "She's not lying. They fined me $300 for my kid's bicycle being left out for 20 minutes. They threatened to evict me for hanging a wind chime," said an elderly woman near the back. More voices rose, stories, fines, threats, a collective storm swelling in the room. Cordell raised his hand to speak, but Marissa beat him to it. "You've used fear to control this neighborhood," she said, "but the law still matters. My grandmother's property is protected, and you tried to steal it." She took a final sheet of paper from her bag, a stamped letter from attorney Penelope Graves, confirming legal representation and the intent to file a formal complaint with the county board and civil court. "I'm not asking you to do the right thing," Marissa said. "I'm telling you, the right thing is coming for you whether you like it or not." Silence fell. Cordell's face had turned pale. He tried to recover, clearing his throat. "This meeting is adjourned," he barked. "No, it's not," someone shouted from the audience. "We want a vote," another voice agreed. I motioned to remove Cordell Thatcher from the board, effective immediately. The room erupted in voices, loud, determined, defiant. Marissa stepped down from the mic and walked back to her seat, breathless. Her hands were shaking, but her face held the calm of someone who had done what she came to do. Cordell stood frozen at the podium, sweat glistening on his forehead, eyes darting to the door like he was searching for an exit. And outside the community center, for the first time in years, the evening air in Lavender Hills felt just a little lighter. That night the community center stayed open much longer than anyone expected. After Cordell Thatcher stormed out, several board members exchanged nervous looks. Mr. Neville stood and attempted to restore order, but the residents weren't interested in scripted apologies. They were standing now, once passive, now energized. The air buzzed not with fear, but with long-suppressed frustration finally erupting. Mrs. Daniels took the floor and began recounting the $4,000 in fines she had accumulated over 2 years, most of them for issues like her teen daughter's car parked slightly over the curb. Then came Mr. Yu, who spoke in a low, steady voice about how his son was once threatened with expulsion from the community pool for bringing a bright-colored towel. He held up photos. They said it disrupted the visual harmony. More people followed, each sharing stories, some quietly, others with rising anger. There was a woman who'd been fined for a flower bed that exceeded the 6-inch rule by 1.5 inches. A widower who'd been told his ramp wasn't visually compliant. An interracial couple who were fined within their first week of moving in. What became clear was this: the HOA had gone far beyond community maintenance. It had become a regime. Marissa sat quietly, notebook in hand, recording names and dates as they spoke. She wasn't at the center of the room anymore, but everyone knew it was her who'd cracked the foundation. Her courage had opened the floodgates. Outside, a reporter from the local paper arrived. Word had spread quickly through social media. Someone had posted a photo of Marissa at the podium. The caption read, "12-year-old dismantles corrupt HOA live at town forum." Comments were flooding in. Other homeowners from nearby neighborhoods were replying with similar horror stories. It wasn't just Lavender Hills, this was happening everywhere. Back inside, Ms. Dobbs, one of the remaining board members, finally stood up. Her voice shook. "I joined the board to make things better. But I see now how far it went. I see what I let happen. I should have said something." Mr. Kirkland added, "We were told the documents were valid, that homeowners had agreed. I didn't check. I should have." The residents demanded immediate action. Someone yelled out, "Then let us vote." Tonight. There wasn't a precedent for an emergency vote, but a local attorney in the room confirmed that, under the community charter, if enough members were present and agreed, they could initiate an emergency resolution. Ballots were made. They used index cards and pens passed out by volunteers. The vote was swift and decisive. Cordell Thatcher was removed from his position as president of the HOA by a vote of 87-3. Marissa watched as Ms. Dobbs and Mr. Kirkland, now acting as temporary chairs, announced a proposal to dissolve all pending fines, pause foreclosure proceedings, and bring in independent auditors to review every decision made by the board in the past 5 years. The room erupted in applause. But Marissa's eyes weren't on the board anymore. She was texting the attorney Penelope Graves. Ms. Graves had responded within minutes, congratulating her and confirming she'd be coming to town the following week to begin formal legal proceedings on behalf of June Kincaid and others who had suffered. When Marissa got home, it was almost midnight. She walked her bike slowly up the driveway. The porch light was on. Inside, her grandmother was awake, her thin frame wrapped in a blanket, her eyes brighter than they'd been in days. "I did it," Marissa whispered, kneeling beside her. "You were right. The truth did matter." June's lips parted slightly. Her hand reached for Marissa's and gave the faintest squeeze. Her voice was hoarse but audible. "I always knew you were the one." Tears welled in Marissa's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was too proud, too strong now. She helped her grandmother back into bed, made tea, and sat by her until she fell asleep. In her room, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line on a fresh page. They thought no one would speak up, but a girl with a notebook and a binder ended the silence. She closed the book and slept for the first time in days, deep and dreamless, because something had changed. The war wasn't over, but the battle was won. The following morning, Lavender Hills awoke to an entirely different rhythm. For the first time in years, neighbors paused to greet one another instead of staring down at the sidewalk. Cars drove more slowly. Lawns went unmowed, but no one seemed to care. There was an air of cautious relief, like the silence after a storm, when the world hasn't quite realized it survived. Marissa opened the front door to find a small crowd gathered by their mailbox. Mrs. Daniels stood there holding a tray of muffins, while Mr. Yu had brought a bag of oranges from his garden. Even Mr. Blackwell, who rarely spoke to anyone, stood with folded arms and an expression of quiet respect. No one said much at first, until Mrs. Daniels gently placed her hand on Marissa's shoulder and said, "You saved us." Marissa, still in her pajamas, blinked in disbelief. Her grandmother sat inside, awake, sipping warm broth. Her color had improved slightly, and though her body still trembled with weakness, her mind was sharper than ever. When Marissa told her about the vote, June closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "I've waited years for that man to be exposed," she whispered. Later that day, Penelope Graves arrived, the sharp, commanding civil rights attorney from Savannah. She wore a fitted navy suit and carried a thick briefcase and a laptop bag, but her smile was kind when she saw Marissa and June. "Well," she said, crouching down to Marissa's level, "I've heard about a lot of brave people in my career, but never one quite like you." Marissa flushed pink. She led Penelope into the dining room, where she had neatly stacked every document, tape, signature comparison, and printed photo into organized folders. Penelope was visibly impressed. "Did you do all this yourself?" "I had help," Marissa said with a little smile, glancing toward the attic door. Over the next several hours, Penelope reviewed every item with laser focus. She asked precise questions, took notes, and nodded occasionally with that slow, lawyerly deliberation that meant she was already planning her argument. "That audio file," Penelope said at one point, "is not just compelling, it's damning." By evening, Penelope had drafted and filed 2 formal legal notices. One to the HOA board, demanding the immediate reversal of all fines and foreclosure attempts against June Kincaid and the other 3 exempt properties, and another to the county registrar, demanding an investigation into forged filings and potential criminal charges against Cordell Thatcher. But it didn't stop there. The story had gone viral. Local news stations arrived that evening, parking their vans along the once-patrolled HOA perimeter. One reporter, a young woman named Ari Monroe, asked Marissa if she would agree to a short interview. The camera light blinked on. Marissa stood in front of her grandmother's house, its wild garden in full bloom, and answered with quiet confidence. "I didn't do this to be on the news," she said. "I did it because my grandma was being hurt. And I think if we don't speak up when something is wrong, it just keeps getting worse." The segment aired that same night under the headline, "HOA brought down by 12-year-old with the truth." People from across the state flooded the Lavender Hills community site with messages of support. Some shared their own HOA horror stories. Others simply wrote, "Thank you, Marissa." By the weekend, Penelope had filed a class action suit on behalf of 22 residents, alleging abuse of power, illegal fines, racial targeting, and willful deception by the HOA board under Cordell's leadership. The new interim board, now led by Ms. Dobbs, promised full cooperation. They scheduled a community-wide meeting, a real one this time, with an open mic, transparent voting, and equal participation. No suits, no threats, just people. At that meeting, Penelope stood beside Marissa as she addressed the crowd again. This time, not as a girl trying to stop something, but as someone who had already changed everything. We didn't just take back our homes, Marissa said. We took back our voices. People stood, people clapped. Even the most skeptical neighbors had tears in their eyes. The final announcement of the night came from Ms. Dobbs. Lavender Hills would be launching a new neighborhood initiative named in honor of the girl who sparked the movement, the Kincaid Foundation for Neighborhood Justice. Its mission would be to help homeowners fight wrongful HOA actions across the state. As Marissa sat beside her grandmother on the porch later that night, her arms wrapped around Biscuit, the stars were brighter than she remembered. The fear that once choked their little corner of the neighborhood had lifted, replaced by something fragile and powerful: dignity. She didn't know what would happen next with Cordell. He hadn't been seen in days, but that didn't matter anymore. The house was safe, her grandmother was safe, and so was the truth. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere in Lavender Hills transformed completely. Once a neighborhood of fear and whispered complaints, it had become something else entirely. A community in the truest sense of the word. Neighbors waved again. Kids played in the park without parents glancing over their shoulders for enforcement drones. The HOA patrols had stopped. The absurd fines vanished. The silence had been broken, and people remembered how to breathe. Marissa rode her bike every afternoon past homes that had once looked closed off, now opening up. Mrs. Daniels had decorated her front lawn with wind chimes again. The Yu family reinstalled their basketball hoop, and for the first time since Marissa could remember, someone drew a sidewalk chalk mural that stretched 3 blocks long without fear of getting a violation. At the end of each ride, she'd stop by her grandmother's chair on the porch and hand her the local paper. June, though still physically weak, read every article, circled names with a highlighter, and smiled every time she saw Penelope Graves mentioned in another case. The class action lawsuit had gained traction fast, and more communities were stepping forward. Lavender Hills had started a domino effect. One Saturday afternoon, Ms. Dobbs visited their home with an invitation in hand, not printed, not official, but handwritten on lilac-colored paper. Community Celebration and Restoration Picnic, hosted by the interim board. "You're our guest of honor," she said to June. "And Marissa," she added, smiling, "we'd love if you said a few words." Marissa blinked. "Like a speech?" "You already gave the speech that changed everything," Ms. Dobbs replied. "This one's just for joy." That Sunday, the same community center that once held cold, joyless HOA forums now hosted folding tables covered in homemade food, floral centerpieces made by neighborhood kids, and a banner that read, "Our neighborhood, our voice." June was wheeled in by a kind neighbor wearing her Sunday cardigan and a pin on her collar that read "Founder." Marissa stood nervously by the microphone, the smell of barbecue and fresh flowers floating in the warm spring air. The podium seemed taller than she remembered. But as she looked out into the crowd, not just at adults, but at children, at tired faces now smiling, at homes once hunted now healing, she didn't feel small anymore. "My name is Marissa Kincaid," she began, "and not that long ago I was just a kid writing in a notebook because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think it would matter, but it turns out telling the truth always matters." The crowd applauded. A few people wiped their eyes. "I didn't stop the HOA by myself," she continued. "I just noticed that what they were doing wasn't fair. But when I spoke up, all of you did too. That's the part I'll never forget." She paused and smiled at her grandmother, who gave her a small thumbs up from her wheelchair. "I think communities are supposed to protect each other," Marissa said, her voice growing stronger. "Not just enforce rules, but care, listen, defend. And that's what we are now. We're not perfect, but we're awake, and no one can take that from us again." The applause this time lasted longer. It wasn't just for the speech. It was for everything that had changed. After the picnic, residents passed around a large card they all signed for June, along with a gift basket filled with tea, yarn, and a framed certificate naming her Keeper of Lavender Hills. But what touched her most was a small envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn picture from a first grader down the street. It showed a little girl in front of a house with a big smile, standing beside an older woman in a chair, with a rainbow over them. On the bottom the girl had written in crooked letters, "Thank you for saving our street," or back home, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the porch, Marissa and June sat quietly watching neighbors walk dogs, blow bubbles, and push strollers down the once intimidating streets. Biscuit napped between them. The fight had been long, it had hurt, but the healing had begun, not just in their home, but everywhere around them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, June whispered, almost to herself, "It feels like home again." Summer arrived with soft winds and golden light, wrapping Lavender Hills in a warmth that hadn't touched the neighborhood in years. Gardens grew wild again, not messy, but expressive, full of color and character. Porch swings creaked with laughter. The sound of children splashing in backyard pools replaced the silence once forced by fear. There were no more pink envelopes, no more patrols, no more curtain-twitching terror of doing something wrong. And it had all started with a girl and a notebook. Marissa spent her mornings walking Biscuit and helping June tend to her front garden. Her grandmother's strength was returning little by little, and though she still needed a cane, her voice had come back fuller, steadier. Every day, June insisted on reading the mail herself, not because she expected threats anymore, but because now she could smile as she threw the last remaining junk HOA circulars straight into the trash. One morning, a courier knocked on their door and handed Marissa a certified envelope. It was from the county registrar. She opened it carefully, her heart quickening. Inside was an official ruling declaring June Kincaid's property fully protected under historic exemption laws, and, more importantly, it confirmed that the forged compliance form had been stricken from all public records. Cordell Thatcher's actions were now a matter of legal record, and charges of forgery, fraud, and abuse of power had been formally recommended for prosecution. Marissa didn't celebrate with shouting or jumping. She just sat next to her grandmother and laid the document in her lap. June read it slowly, then let out a breath so deep it seemed like it had waited years to be released. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from quiet triumph. The final twist came a week later. A man in a dark suit arrived at their door, introduced himself as a representative from a local nonprofit that fought housing discrimination. He said, "We read about Marissa's story. We're launching a state-level campaign called Not One More Fine, and we want her to be the face of it." Marissa blinked. "You want me?" He nodded. "You uncovered what adults were too afraid to. That's exactly the kind of courage people need to see." They didn't want her to speak like a politician. They wanted her to be herself, a young girl who believed that fairness mattered, who had stood up not because she was powerful, but because she knew what pain looked like when it reached the people you love. The campaign took off quickly. Marissa was invited to speak at city council meetings, school assemblies, and community events. She wore her old school uniform by choice, because it reminded people that even someone young and overlooked could make a difference. She never bragged. She always mentioned her grandmother, and she always carried her notebook, now filled with signatures, quotes, and a growing list of families from other neighborhoods writing to say, "You gave us hope." Cordell Thatcher was arrested that August after failing to comply with subpoenas. He tried to claim everything was for the good of the community, but too many voices had risen against him. His fall wasn't public spectacle, it was justice, quiet, steady, unavoidable. In September, Marissa returned to school as a local hero, though she insisted she was still just a kid who liked writing things down. She kept a pencil behind her ear and sat at the back of the class near the window, where she could still see the tops of the lavender trees blowing in the wind. On the anniversary of the HOA Forum, Lavender Hills held a candlelight walk, not a protest, but a celebration. Families carried lanterns. Children carried signs they'd made themselves. And on the center stage, under twinkling lights and a velvet sky, Marissa read a poem she'd written. They built a wall of rules and fines like falling rain. But someone lit a lantern and walked straight through the pain. And now we plant our flowers where silence used to grow, because one small voice can be enough to tell the darkness no. When she finished, no one clapped right away. They stood quietly, some holding their hands to their hearts, others wiping tears. Then, slowly, applause rippled across the crowd, not wild, but deep and steady. Marissa looked into the audience and saw her grandmother in the front row, tears in her eyes and pride radiating like sunlight. And for the first time in her life, Marissa didn't just feel like a girl with a notebook. She felt like someone who had changed the course of her world, and left it better than she found it. In my opinion, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's necessary. It closes a circle that began with injustice, fear, and silence, and ends with courage, truth, and a community reborn. What makes it powerful isn't that a villain was defeated, but that a girl, young, underestimated, and full of quiet conviction, became the catalyst for transformation in a place where adults had long given up. Marissa's victory is not loud or flashy. It's steady, earned, and deeply emotional. She doesn't become someone else. She simply becomes more of herself, and that's what makes her unforgettable. Her grandmother's strength, the neighborhood's shift from compliance to resistance, and the final embrace of truth over fear feel like a real emotional release. Not just for the characters, but for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of unjust authority. What I love most is that the story leaves a legacy, a ripple effect. It reminds us that even the most rigid systems can crack when someone dares to tell the truth out loud. And sometimes, the most unexpected hero is a 12-year-old girl with a notebook and a voice that refuses to be ignored.